At 11:30 p.m., tsunami sirens sliced through the darkness as Japan's coastline convulsed from a magnitude 7.6 earthquake, pushing millions into panic from Aomori to the swaying high-rises of Tokyo. This was no isolated tremor. It triggered warnings that something even larger could follow. Why are officials and scientists now preparing for the possibility of a cascading sequence of megaquakes? And what does that mean for the entire Pacific Rim? The answers begin now. Seconds after the shaking eased, only one thing hit harder than the aftershocks: the sound. Sirens, sharp and relentless, rolled across the black coast, each blast echoing off seawalls and concrete. Streetlights flickered. Entire towns from Hachinohe to Kuji rattled in the dark. But it was the rising wail of the tsunami alarm that cut through confusion and forced every heartbeat to surge. People spilled from their homes in pajamas and slippers, phones buzzing with emergency alerts. The air carried dust and the metallic sting of fear. A dog barked once, then silence. Japan's municipal siren network, built for moments like this, unleashed a single command: get to higher ground now. Families grabbed only what they could: a coat, a flashlight, a child's hand. Headlights appeared on winding coastal roads as cars began snaking away from the sea. Inside homes, dishes lay shattered and books covered the floor. Outside, the night pulsed with sirens and hurried footsteps. The darkness sharpened every sound: gravel crunching underfoot, car doors slamming, public address systems repeating the same warning. For those who had lived through 2011, the alarms reopened memories they had tried to bury. For others, it was their first taste of the raw panic that comes when nature speaks without warning. Traffic lights froze. Some people ran, others drove, but everyone moved with one purpose. The sirens did not soften. They were the voice of urgency drilled into the nation by history. Every minute mattered. There was no time to check the news or call relatives. The alarm spoke louder than any broadcast warning of waves that had not yet arrived but could swallow the coast within minutes. Between each blast came a silence even more frightening. Then the next scream of the siren. Hearts raced in the dark. Every sense locked onto the sound that meant danger. The night belonged to the sirens. The ground had barely settled when the scale of what struck began to take shape. Seismometers across Japan confirmed a magnitude 7.6 earthquake, the kind of force that turns routine into disaster in under a minute. The epicenter lay offshore east of Aomori Prefecture, where the Pacific Plate dives beneath northern Honshu. At a depth of nearly 50 kilometers, the rupture tore along the megathrust boundary, sending shockwaves across the archipelago. In Hachinohe, the shaking reached JMA intensity 6 plus a threshold where standing becomes nearly impossible and furniture empties itself onto the floor. Store owners described the violence as unlike anything they had experienced, even in a nation accustomed to constant tremors. Glass shattered, ceiling panels crashed down. Older buildings split with long cracks running from floor to ceiling. Along the coast, towns familiar with earthquakes found themselves facing something far more punishing. Even hundreds of kilometers away in Tokyo, the quake arrived as a slow, rolling sway. High-rises drifted on invisible waves, ceiling lamps swinging in wide arcs as cupboard doors rattled. People paused in doorways, gripping frames as the ground wavered beneath them. For a moment, Tokyo was connected to the unfolding disaster by the simple reality of the Earth shifting everywhere at once. Seismologists quickly identified the fault type: a classic thrust event on the subduction interface, the same mechanism behind Japan's most devastating disasters. A locked plate, stress building for decades. Then a sudden jolt that lifts the seafloor and everything above it. The rupture lasted about 30 seconds, with most of the slip concentrated in the first 15, enough to trigger tsunami warnings across the coast and shake buildings from Hokkaido to the Kanto Plain. The numbers told the story bluntly: upper 6 shaking in Hachinohe, lower 6 in surrounding towns, 5+ across northern Honshu and southern Hokkaido. Alarms blared, elevators froze, trains halted automatically. Public address systems repeated the same urgent message. In the darkness, one thing was clear. This was no routine tremor. Magnitudes, depths, intensities. They became more than statistics. They became the measure of a night when the Earth's hidden forces erupted without warning and the boundary between normal and disaster disappeared in seconds. In Hachinohe, the aftermath felt immediate and deeply personal. 23 people were injured as buildings shook so violently that storefront glass burst outward and ceiling tiles crashed to the floor. One store owner recalled how the familiar rumble instantly escalated into something far more dangerous. Bottles tumbled from shelves. The floor heaved. The walls rippled with every shockwave. For the first time, he feared the entire structure might collapse around him. Emergency crews moved through darkened streets, stepping over debris and dodging fallen signs. In some shops' aisles were blocked by toppled merchandise, the air thick with spilled cooking oil and broken ceramics. People helped one another out of damaged buildings, some bleeding from cuts, others limping from twisted ankles or bruises from falling shelves. The injuries were real, but the emotional shock ran even deeper. A woman still trembling whispered that she had not heard the earth roar like that since the disaster more than a decade earlier. Hospitals reported a steady stream of patients throughout the night. Most suffered minor lacerations, sprains, or head injuries from falling objects. Waiting rooms filled quickly. Nurses handed out blankets as families arrived still in pajamas, clutching hastily packed bags. Volunteers offered bottled water and comfort to frightened children. Outside, the damage varied street by street. Some neighborhoods saw only cracked plaster, while others faced shattered windows and collapsed awnings. In districts built on softer ground, the shaking seemed endless, the earth refusing to settle. Store owners swept glass by flashlight, already bracing for the next aftershock. A sense of vulnerability lingered in the cold night air. If this was only the beginning, what might follow? As the sirens faded and adrenaline began to ebb, the weight of the event settled heavily. For many, this quake would be remembered not only through numbers but through the scars it left behind. Tsunami warnings swept across Aomori, Iwate, and Hokkaido, sending a wave of urgency through coastal towns and cities. The message was unmistakable. Move inland. Climb. Do not wait. Headlights stretched into long, unbroken lines as families, neighbors, and strangers all sought the same refuge higher ground. On National Route 45, traffic thickened almost instantly. Cars crawled forward, packed with families carrying only the essentials they could grab in seconds. Police officers and volunteers' flashlights cutting through the darkness directed vehicles at intersections where the power had failed. The flow slowed, but it never lost direction. Years of nationwide drills had prepared people for this exact scenario, and that discipline now guided every movement. Emergency officials broadcast instructions over loudspeakers, voices rising above the rumble of engines and the occasional aftershock. Evacuate immediately to higher ground. Leave belongings behind. Do not return until the all-clear is issued. The warning repeated in Japanese, English, and local dialects echoing through shuttered streets and darkened shopping districts. Neon signs flickered as businesses shut their doors. Convenience stores became glowing waypoints for those evacuating on foot. Painted arrows and emergency lamps marked narrow alleys and steep staircases leading to community centers sitting safely above the tsunami line. Elderly residents leaned on neighbors or rescue workers. Children clung to parents, pale and silent in the cold night air. City buses, taken over by emergency officials, stopped at every corner to pick up those unable to walk the distance. By midnight, nearly 90,000 people had fled their homes. Dozens of municipalities tracked evacuees and relayed updates to regional disaster headquarters. Control rooms monitored live feeds and GPS data coordinating traffic flow and preparing additional shelters. Roads designed for everyday commutes strained under the sudden weight of thousands moving at once. Bottlenecks formed at tunnels and tight hillside turns every stalled engine, tightening the knot of tension. Still, the evacuation held its rhythm. The hard lessons of 2011 echoed in every coordinated effort and every unspoken agreement to help one another. The fear was real, shaped by memory and magnified by uncertainty. As the night deepened, the hum of engines and hurried footsteps became the sound of a region determined not to repeat its past. Within hours of the quake, Japan's disaster management system was fully mobilized. Before sunrise, the Cabinet's Crisis Office convened, bringing together officials from the Meteorological Agency, emergency services, and affected prefectures. On national television, the government's chief spokesperson delivered a message that was calm but unmistakably serious. The risk of another major earthquake in the affected region would remain elevated for at least a week. More than 100 coastal municipalities from Hokkaido to Chiba were urged to stay alert, keep emergency supplies close, and be prepared to evacuate again without hesitation. Authorities did not predict a larger quake, nor did they issue new evacuation orders. Instead, they asked residents to review evacuation routes, check food and water charge phones, and have flashlights ready. In city halls and community shelters, staff distributed blankets and bottled water to evacuees who had spent the night away from home. Local leaders repeated the same message. This was not the time to relax. Behind the scenes, seismologists briefed government officials on the science. After a shock of this size, the probability of another strong earthquake, possibly of similar magnitude, rises for several days. Most aftershocks are smaller, but in Japan's active subduction zones, a second major event has happened before. The Meteorological Agency's public aftershock forecast explained that the next week would be critical. Residents were urged to avoid unnecessary trips to the coast, keep vehicles fueled, and have basic medical supplies on hand. The advisory covered 118 municipalities, each with its own disaster plan, yet all now sharing the same uneasy uncertainty. In interviews, government scientists emphasized that the guidance was precautionary, not a prediction. Still, the memory of 2011 shaped every word. The decision to issue such wide-reaching advice reflected both the seriousness of the current threat and the lessons learned from past catastrophes. For now, Japan waited, a country on edge preparing for aftershocks and hoping the worst had already passed. At Kuji Port, tide gauges registered a wave just over 70 centimeters, arriving less than an hour after the earthquake. Smaller surges struck other harbors powerful enough to scatter cars and slam fishing boats against concrete walls. Japan's evacuation policy does not wait for confirmation. It operates on one principle: assume the worst until proven otherwise. At nuclear plants from Hokkaido to Fukushima, crews in protective suits swept through control rooms checking for abnormalities. This time, every system held. No alarms, no radiation spikes, no echo of the catastrophe that claimed 22,000 lives in 2011. The contrast was stark, but the memory lingered, shaping every cautious decision. Scientists quickly identified the cause of the tsunami risk, a classic megathrust event, the Pacific Plate forcing its way beneath northern Honshu, lifting the seafloor in a sudden vertical jolt. That upward motion launches tsunamis even when the rupture occurs far offshore. Most of the slip happened in the first 15 seconds, a concentrated burst of energy that triggered the sweeping coastal warnings. Thrust faults like this are familiar to anyone who studies Japan's seismic past. In 2011, the disaster began with a magnitude 7.3 foreshock 2 days before the main magnitude 9 event and the devastating tsunami that followed. So when a magnitude 7 strikes along the Japan Trench, the same question always returns. Is this a warning shot or the first step toward something larger? This pattern stretches beyond Japan's shores. In recent months, the Pacific Ring of Fire has seen a series of major quakes, a magnitude 8 in Kamchatka, a magnitude 7.6 in Japan, a magnitude 7 off Alaska. Scientists warn against assuming direct causation, but the clustering is a reminder of the Pacific Plate's constant restlessness. Its 40,000-kilometer arc is always under tension. For people living along these margins, risk is not an abstract idea. In British Columbia, the same tectonic forces lie just offshore. Even distant quakes can send lamps swaying in high-rise apartments. The lesson is simple. Preparedness is not optional. The Earth can move at any time. Tonight, Japan remains on edge. Coastlines braced. Communities listening for the next tremor. Scientists warn that the Pacific Plate is restless and seismic risk is rising across the Ring of Fire. Readiness is survival. The Earth's pressure builds quietly, but the next release could change everything. Stay alert and share your thoughts below.